getting a very good signal through there. I'll do a little diagnosis and we'll come back. So now that we have determined that our PTO switch fix wasn't much of a fix, and that everything else in the system does work, I'm going to fix this connector here on the PTO. This is the connector itself. There's the terminal. I've cleaned it up and brought it back a little bit, and then I'm going to solder it on there and run some heat shrink up on it. After we get this done, we'll cinch up some of the wiring back there and prepare for the switch to come in. And that'll be pretty close to having the wiring done on this. So get some flux in there, some real dirty flux too. What you want is flux with a bunch of fabrication debris in there. You want a bunch of, you know, you want a bunch of metal and flakes of insulation. You don't want it to be clean. You just, you know, gob it on there. There we go. Starting to flow. She's hot enough now. Oh yeah. That'll do. Yep, that's pretty good. So here she is. Let her cool off a little bit and then run this heat shrink up in there. Right about there. I used green because I have a green wire coming out of the reverse relay for this guy, so there's green somewhere else in the harness to indicate it's right. Okay. Now we let it cool off and pry the tab back a little bit so it'll seat. Tab on the back here. Uh-oh, I got a glob of solder there. That might affect whether or not it goes into the connector. We'll see. It goes like that. Yeah, it's not gonna go. I gotta get that out of there. It's gonna be the best way to do that. I could try heating it and melting it down a little bit, but I don't want to get the heat shrink all janked up. There it goes. Get in there. Alright. That should go in now. There we go. Okay. So, we got her fixed. This side here, they didn't see much corrosion here, probably because there was so much engine oil and grease and crap out here that it never had a chance to get corroded. So the terminal itself was pretty good. It's just the connection to the terminal was broken, so that should do it. Shop is a wreck. I've got stuff everywhere. I'm going to clean up a little bit, and then we'll work on making everything look a little prettier in there. And we'll be back. So what I ended up doing, I wasn't happy with the configuration that I had set up. Some of the safety switches and stuff were bypassed on this tractor when I got it. And as I stated before, I'm not advocating that anybody bypass any of these things. But this is my own personal tractor, and I don't plan on having anyone else use it, so. You know, some of the switches were bypassed, and some things were still kept in the harness, even though they were non-functional. And I said, you know, better than it was, and I'm okay with that, but really, I'm not. So I took the whole harness out of the tractor, and you can see I have it mocked up in place right now. I pulled back all of the electrical tape and just zip tied the harness together so I kind of knew what lengths I was working with, so I didn't totally start from scratch. But I modified the PTO circuit so that the relay is controlled directly. So the PTO is still controlled by a relay, but that relay is controlled directly through the PTO switch. So that required some modifications of the pinouts. I went through and removed all of the additional wiring that was not necessary anymore. So if you look at this plug that would normally be underneath the pedestal there, or underneath the battery tray, I actually removed basically half of the wiring going to the front and back of the tractor. What we have left in the harness here is, on the left is a ground, the next one's blue, and that's for the lights. The next one is gray for the PTO, and then we have a white over here for the low fuel level switch, and then over here, this is the additional white wire for the rear PTO, which I kept in the harness. So I just was able to fish all the wires out of the rear section of the harness, pull them up to this connector, and unpin them from the connector. So that's been cleaned up. The indicator connector, I did the same thing. I depinned the no longer used indicators. And I'm not going to get into the specifics because I don't want to encourage people to do this. But the whole reason that I'm doing it personally, and like I said, I'm not advocating for this, the whole reason I'm doing it personally is to simplify the wiring and give it less places to fail. And the places that it normally would fail, I've actually removed the entire component and the wiring itself. So there's a pile of wiring, pile of components. So the next step was to check functionality. So let's turn this on. So I've got, come on, get in the second position. There, okay. So that's the run and lights circuit active. Right now the PTO switch is on and the clutch is engaged. I have indicators for low fuel and low oil. If I go to crank, since the PTO switch is on right now, the start circuit will not work. You can see it telling me to disengage PTO. And it does disengage the PTO because it loses its power signal from there. So the interlock is still in place for starting, so you can't start it with the, the PTO on. But otherwise, it's greatly simplified. And the other benefit is that none of the PTO current, like the load current for the PTO, is actually going to pass through this switch, which is really handy. Now the relay itself is controlling the load and handling all of the high power for that. I lost a lot of the voltage drop I was getting. Now this connection is not getting hot anymore where it was before. The low voltage light actually turns on at a more proper voltage in respect to actual battery voltage. There's still about a volt of drop between the battery, key switch, PTO relay, and PTO itself. Some of that's just through the key switch itself. But yeah, the low voltage indicator, the amps indicator on the dash, comes on about 11.8 volts, which I consider a little bit low for a charging circuit. But it's way better than it basically coming on before. The connections were so bad everywhere that it thought the voltage was low when in fact it really wasn't. So now that the actual battery voltage is pretty closely related to what this low voltage sensor is seeing. It's a more accurate indicator of what's actually going on. So now that I've tested it and mocked everything up, I'm going to pull it back out, clean it up, tape everything together, and then go back in for the final install. Overall though, pretty happy with it now. Take it over to the bench and clean up this mess. Okay, so here we are. Everything is bolted down and in place, nothing's prepped and painted. But I did want to show you how the harness ended up looking as it went in, and some of the modifications that we made, including some aftermarket gauges here. So I took a three pod gauge, split it down the middle, and made a 2-pod out of it. For, let's see if I can hold it steady. We have amps and oil pressure. I have it located right underneath the tilt button, and that tilt button can still work. And then also, you can still pull out the tunnel cover. I hemmed and hawed about it for days, weeks. I had these gauges laying around, and I couldn't figure out where I wanted to put them to keep them out of the way. I wouldn't hit them. I didn't want to have it sitting up here on the stack. I didn't want to do a bunch of modification to the dash. So that's where they ended up going. So that's been done. So I modified the harness for an ammeter. I've got the full-size battery in there now. One of the areas that's also really tight in here is where this control rod comes up through. Be careful with the harness right there. Gets a little tight. I'll show you what I did to hold everything in place. I repaired this battery hold down on this side. You can see where I've welded on a piece of steel right there to grab the battery again. That was all rusted out. I took this tray here and I added weld nuts everywhere that I needed them. Back in here, these were gone. I put in a stud over here for the ground. So now all the ground distribution can come from that stud, which makes things a little simpler. It's a lot of stuff going on once you put the battery in there. So what I'm going to do is, since you can't really see the harness right now, I mean you can see one side of it, I'm going to basically show you that everything works. Oh, here's that other, I made another tie down for the battery here. That's some bracket that I made here in the shop. You can see just how tight it gets once you put everything in. There's the new fuse holder. There's the new PTO relay. Just barely clears where that cable comes down through there. I got some new, well, new to this tractor. They're not brand new. I made new main battery cables. So that ground there runs down through the harness out to the main lug here. I've got a temporary ground hooked up to the starter and a temporary positive out to the starter. Got the PTO mocked up, pressure switch and stuff, so basically we can see that everything works. So let's try stuff. So turn on the key switch, we got lights. We got indicators. We got lights. We got lights. If you watch the ammeter closely, you can see it flicker when it turns the lights on. The PTO works, and you can see the ammeter pulling amps there. Yeah, so with the PTO off, we get a spinny spin. With the PTO on, we get no spinny spin. With the PTO on, we cannot crank. And when we can't crank, It tells you to disengage the PTO. Idiot. Okay. Turn the PTO off. Watch this starter do its dance. Whee! So the starter does work. I kind of need a third hand to like hold this while I flip the switch. Oh, here we go. Let's do this. Aha. So solenoid's working. You hear it clicking. Back to the lights. Ran the wiring out to here for the auxiliary circuit too. And the hour meter does work. I just have it disconnected now, so I'm not running up hours on it. But everything works. We got the low fuel, we got the low oil, PTO, and starter. Just wanted to show you that everything does work. And I'll set you up over here. We'll pull out that battery. It's nice that it's a full-size battery, but it makes it a pain to work on. And we will come in here and actually look at the harness. Okay. I'll get you a closer look at that little bracket that I made for the battery tie down to. I didn't have much to go off of because the original was so shot. So I kind of just eyeballed it and made it work. You can see I do have the battery tray, or the mat that goes underneath, the plastic mat underneath the battery, so it's as factory as it can be. Here's a closer look at that tie down I made. Real simple, just a piece of angle iron that I bent, and then drilled a hole through and oblong the hole so that this bolt can come down here and pull into that section right there. Yeah, there we go. So that took a little fiddling, but it worked. And everything's primed and ready, so I'll take the tray out too. Now we can see in there. So here's what we got. I took the harness while it was on the bench and had everything zip tied together and then taped everything up in the position that it needed to be. Had to make a loop here for the relay to come down around that cable. And then what I did is, like I said, I added some weld nuts in here. There were some holes that were already in the tray, and so I put some 1/4 weld nuts underneath so I could use these tie downs for the harness to keep the harness in place. Like one of the tighter areas, like I was saying before, is this. The control rod for the hydro. It clears. Barely, but it does clear. See, we're not touching there. Back over to the key switch. Left enough of the wires sticking out that you can still tell what the colors are. And then the auxiliary wiring comes down out of that harness. And I kept the factory colors as much as I could. So I ran the ammeter in series with the black wire, which comes from this fuse. So coming from the fuse over to the splice, out to the ammeter on black, and then back from the ammeter out to the switch on black. And then there's a blue wire back in there for the lights, kept the factory color, and then a green for ground. So that's all in there. Yeah, I got some tie downs there to hold the harness in place. And then over here I've got one more. Nice little 5/16 bolt right here. Hold the harness in place there. The harness is nice and tight, it doesn't really flop around. Everything just barely clears. Got some new cables in there. Everything's nice and clean. Everything works pretty well. So yeah, you can see the connector up to the dash still fits nice. And then the connector that goes back this way, that section of harness that goes behind the plate, goes down here and right there. So that's not rubbing anything either. It's pretty tight once everything's in here, but it goes back down in there. You can see it on the right-hand side coming down. Everything fits. And everything works. So, tray is going to come back out and get painted. Tested a little bit of the paint here on the frame. Looks like it's going to hold up decent. It's not an exact match, but I'm going for function over form, so doesn't have to be perfect, just got to look decent. So I'll paint the tray, clean up everything in there, and then finish the prep on the gauges here, and paint that up. Let me show you here. I can show you. So part of the problem with these gauges is how much they stick out in the back. I didn't want to cut a huge hole in the dash. I wanted it to be as simple of a modification to the tractor as possible. So basically there's just two holes right here that come through to bolt the gauges to the dash. And then, yep, see, you can still pull the tonneau cover off without hitting the gauges. So everything clears, everything works. So that will round up the majority of the harnessing on this. Like I said, I simplified some of it just to make sure there were less circuits to be concerned about, and it should give plenty of years of service out of this thing. A little less complicated and some nice new stuff in there. So there she is. Hope you guys enjoyed the electrical portion of the series, and now we're going to move back over to the M18, which has been sitting in this plastic bag for months. So get started on that bad boy. And here she is, guys. Let me know what you think. See you later.